Hello, fellow time travelers and lovers of the offbeat. Welcome back to History's Hidden Weird, the podcast that plucks the strangest threads from the fabric of history and holds them up to the light. I'm your host, Quinn Strange, and today's episode will have you looking at pigeons a little differently. Those feathery sidewalk dwellers you probably ignore? They almost helped win World War II. Yes, today we're diving into one of the most bizarre wartime research projects ever proposed, Project Pigeon. Also known, perhaps more ominously, as Project Orcon, short for Organic Control. The idea was simple, strange, and surprisingly brilliant: use trained pigeons to guide missiles. No, really. Let's rewind to the early 1940s. World War II is raging, and the United States is searching for a way to develop more accurate guided missiles. Radar and electronic guidance systems were still in their infancy. Computers, as we know them, didn't exist. And homing in on a moving target was a major technical challenge. Enter B.F. Skinner, yes, that Skinner. The father of behaviorism, the man famous for his work on operant conditioning, and the inventor of the Skinner box. He believed animals could be trained to perform complex tasks through positive reinforcement. And he had a wild idea for how to apply his theories to the war effort. In 1943, Skinner approached the U.S. military with a proposal: create a missile guidance system powered by pigeons. The birds would literally peck their way to victory. Here's how it worked. Skinner's team would place 3 trained pigeons inside the nose cone of a missile. In front of them was a screen that projected an image of the target, say, a ship. The pigeons had been trained to recognize that image and peck at it. Sensors would read where the pigeons were pecking and adjust the missile's trajectory to keep the target in the center of the screen. If the target drifted off center, the pigeons would peck to correct it, literally guiding the bomb by instinct. And here's the wild part: it worked. In early tests, the pigeons were remarkably accurate. They could track moving targets and keep pecking even while being jostled and spun. Skinner proved that the pigeons could not only be trained to respond to target images, but could also withstand the chaos of flight. They were fast, reliable, and unaffected by jamming or interference. No enemy could scramble a pigeon's brain, at least not electronically. The U.S. military didn't know what to make of it. Skinner was awarded a small grant, about $25,000, which is roughly $400,000 today. His team constructed prototypes, tested the systems, and trained a new generation of avian aviators. The project became known internally as Project Orcon, but Skinner always called it what it was: Project Pigeon. But despite the progress, the military remained skeptical. Not because it didn't work, it did, but because of optics. Can you imagine trying to explain to a general, or worse, the American public, that their bombs were being guided by barn birds? Even though radar-guided systems were still clunky and unproven, they seemed more modern. More serious. Using pigeons, no matter how effective, felt laughable. Eventually, in 1944, Project Pigeon was canceled. Skinner was frustrated but not surprised. He later said, "Our problem was no one would take us seriously." But here's the kicker: the military revived the concept a few years later during the Cold War. In 1948, the Navy reconsidered the idea and tested it under a new name, still Orcon, but ultimately abandoned it again in favor of rapidly developing electronic guidance systems. So, no, we never had pigeon-guided missiles streaking through the skies of Europe. But for a brief moment in history, we were just a few bureaucratic approvals away from it. Now, let's zoom out and appreciate just how weird this really was. This wasn't the only animal-based weapon idea floated during the war. You may have heard of bat bombs, where bats carrying tiny incendiary devices were released over Japanese cities. or anti-tank dogs trained by the Soviets to blow up German tanks. Compared to those grim tales, Project Pigeon almost feels wholesome. Skinner genuinely loved his birds. He treated them more like lab partners than tools. They were fed well, kept healthy, and trained with care. In his view, they weren't just soldiers, they were proof of concept. Living computers in an age when the idea of a computer was still abstract. In today's terms, we might call them biological AI, a low-tech neural network with feathers. Looking back, Skinner's idea was revolutionary. He saw intelligence and potential in places others didn't. In an era of cold metal and escalating violence, he proposed something profoundly odd, and in its own way, beautiful. That maybe nature had already evolved the perfect guidance system. There's also something poetic about it, don't you think? The idea of doves of peace being used to guide weapons of war. It's deeply ironic and deeply human. And that's why we tell these stories. Because the line between genius and absurdity is sometimes only visible in hindsight. Project Pigeon never saw combat, but it deserves a spot in the annals of military history, not because it changed the war, but because it changed the way we think. The next time you see a pigeon bobbing along a sidewalk, remember, their ancestors were almost Cold War weapons. And maybe, that bird is judging you for not recognizing their service. I'm Quinn Strange, and this has been History's Hidden Weird. If this story made you smile, squint, or shake your head in disbelief, share it with a fellow history nerd or a bird lover. And remember, history doesn't always fly straight, but it sure leaves feathers behind. If you liked today's episode, leave a review, share with your weird history-loving friends, and hit follow. Have a strange story you want us to cover? Comment below and we will see what we can do. Until next time, stay weird.